At least once a month for as long as I can remember, I'm put in the very awkward situation of having to tell a pregnant woman that she can't take yoga classes in our studios. We have strong athletic classes. We hang upside down from yoga trapezes. We do deep stretching that's totally inappropriate if you have relaxin hormone pumping through your body. And we're just not a prenatal studio. It's not what we're set up for. We've certainly had workshops and teachers come in to teach that in the past, but it's not on our regular drop-in schedule. The reason it's an awkward situation is because about half the time, women push back and get pretty upset at me, and they say that I don't understand their body. I shouldn't be telling them what to do with their body. It's their choice. They know what's safe and what's not. And I think in most cases, people haven't really looked at the research. The birthing stats right now are pretty scary, especially in developed countries. I'm going to say that again, not developing countries, developed countries. The most developed countries have some of the bigger problems, like the US, for example. Premature birth, miscarriage rates, they're all through the roof. And people don't really realize right now, anywhere from 11 to 12% of pregnancies have early deliveries, and about half those have no known cause, but about 30% are ruptures. So from things like hanging upside down in a yoga trapeze. As soon as I say this to people, they show me their Instagram feed and show me a woman with a barbell on her shoulders doing squats at a CrossFit box, or a woman with an exposed 8-month belly doing a handstand or a drop back in yoga, as if that picture is somehow proof that that's a safe practice. I don't think it is. I don't think I am telling people what to do. I think I'm just looking at the data and trying to be a safe teacher and trying to keep my yoga students safe, and I think that makes sense. But it's a challenging situation for sure. If you're new here, it's the Lucas Rockwood Show. I'm a yoga teacher, a trainer, a serial entrepreneur. I'm a father of 3. And on this week's show, we'll be chatting with a woman who had a premature birth, a journalist, and she ended up investigating and writing about the history of birthing practices, premature birth specifically, uncovered a bunch of very unusual, interesting practices, including babies being incubated in ovens, part of circus sideshows, and all kinds of really strange, unusual, but interesting history of premature birth that tells us a lot about where we are today and potentially where we're going. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, the best way to support me is to leave a rating and review in iTunes or to share the show on social. If you have a question for the show, find me on Instagram. I'm at Lucas Rockwood. You can direct message me there. Thanks for listening. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called Premature, and I am joined here with Sarah Digregorio. Sarah's a writer. She's written for a whole bunch of publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Village Voice, Food and Wine, BuzzFeed, Parade, and Savior. Her work has been included in Best American Food Writing, yearly anthologies 3 different times. She has a new book we'll be chatting about today. It's called Early: The History of Premature Birth and What It Tells Us About Being Human. You can learn more at her website, and her book's available on Amazon, both of which we'll link up to in the show notes. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I always like to start with definitions. So for people listening, what is the technical cutoff? What is considered a premature birth?
Yeah, that's a really good place to start. So a typical healthy pregnancy lasts somewhere between 37 and 42 weeks, and anything before 37 weeks is considered premature. So that's counted in gestational age. And there are several different definitions within prematurity. Extremely premature is less than 28 weeks. Very premature is between 28 and 32 weeks. And moderate to late premature is between 32 and 36 weeks.
And I don't know a ton about premature birth, but from what I understand, I have 3 kids, and from what I do understand, like when I was doing just light research, things like smoking and drug use and all these kind of even medications and stuff, the biggest correlation that I saw was not directly linked to things, but directly linked to low birth weight. And I thought that was really a surprising thing I came across.
Do you mean in terms of the risks to the baby? Is low birth weight the most sort of the best metric of the severity of their outcome?
Well, I was looking at like drug use and smoking and alcohol abuse in infants and things like that. And the biggest thing I just thought like there was like all kinds of things that could potentially happen, but the consistent factor was just low birth weight.
Yeah. So in terms of the causes of premature birth, there are a lot, and also 50% of premature births have no known medical cause. So we can say some things, certainly, but we don't know everything. There's still a lot to know. In terms of risk factors, yes, substance abuse is a risk factor. I don't think that most experts I spoke to would say that that is actually, substance abuse is not the most common risk factor for premature birth by a long shot. I have spoken to experts who say that the opioid crisis has impacts with premature births in some parts of the country. But, in terms of risk factors, a lot of what we know has to do with going into pregnancy healthy. Factors like high blood pressure, diabetes, things like that can put you at a higher risk for giving birth early. But again, we don't have an explanation for a lot of premature births, and the United States does have a very, very high rate of premature birth, especially for such a rich, highly resourced country. And a lot of public health experts believe that, a lot of this goes back to really big structural issues around how we care for our population in general. How accessible is healthcare to the population? Not having protections in place for workers in terms of giving lighter physical duties to pregnant women if it's requested by a doctor.
Interesting.
All of those things. So there's a lot of really big structural problems that feed into the issue of premature birth.
So I have 3 kids. They're born in 3 different countries, in UK, in Spain, and in Germany, and a little bit different experience, but 2 of them were born via cesarean, 1 of them natural, and I had all kinds of ideas about birth before the kids came along, and natural birth, and the American system's messed up, and they're just trying to give cesareans to everyone. And then then I had kids, and I started watching. I think the one that really got me was I watched this film, which I'm sure you've seen, The Business of Being Born, which is this documentary film all about how the modern birthing systems are all messed up, and we should all have natural birth. And then at the end of the film, she has a cesarean, and it's just this weird. It perfectly sums up my feelings about it, which is, I don't know. All I know is I want a healthy baby, and
That's right.
I've walked away from all these experiences just with my hands in the air. I don't know. I mean, I've certainly spent time in Scandinavia. I've, like I said, kids born in multiple countries. I don't know, but what I do know is that the U.S. is terrible, right? In terms of infant mortality, in terms of SIDS, in terms of birth complications, and the U.S. medical system is awesome. And I can say this as somebody who's lived abroad most of my life. It's great. So, do you have any theories about what's going on? Is it psychological? Is it mental emotional stuff? What do you think?
I think that there's a lot to say about this. So, yes, I agree with you that we have the healthcare providers we have in this country are by and large amazing. They have amazing education. They go into healthcare to help people. And we are lucky that we live in a highly resourced country. We have all of the technology that we need. And so, you're right. There is this sort of disconnect between, we have all these advantages, and somehow we don't have very good health outcomes, particularly for mothers and babies. And I think that one of the issues around this is that we think of health as sort of existing in these very specific and narrow spheres. Okay, I'm pregnant now. I'm going to go get my prenatal care. I'm going to, give birth. I'm going to be healthy. I'm going to give birth to a healthy baby. And, we're all doing our best with that. And all of our healthcare providers are doing their best to help us get there. But I think as a country, we don't take care of each other in some of the ways that would lead us to go into pregnancy healthier. So even things as simple as thinking about Medicaid. So Medicaid is available to most pregnant women. Pregnant women qualify for Medicaid at a much higher income than the general population. So the hope is that no pregnant woman should be without insurance so she can get prenatal care. The problem with that is that if you are only qualifying for health insurance during this very narrow period of time that you are pregnant, you might have untreated health concerns that you've had previously that you didn't have the ability to go get help for. And so now you're going into pregnancy and you're not as healthy as you could have been because you couldn't afford insurance before. Not only that, but women are kicked off Medicaid like 6 weeks after birth. So now the health of the next pregnancy might also be compromised because many women, again, don't have access to insurance, don't have access to health care. That's just one example, and the way that there are some perverse incentives for hospitals and healthcare providers in the sense that they are paid by procedure. I do not think that most healthcare providers are sitting there thinking like, let me do a C-section so I can get paid more today. I really don't think that happens. But I think that they have a sense of, what is, they want to avoid any risk, which is understandable. And, also they are financially incentivized to do more procedures. And so it sort of all contributes to this very complex picture where I think everyone truly is doing their best, but the systems are not really set up for health.
It's a funny space. Like I said, I'm a parent and I've had a bunch of different experiences, and I'm a yoga teacher. So people come into the studio wanting to practice at different stages, pre and postnatal. And, it's such a emotionally charged market and time for carrying children. And I think what I find kind of troubling is people don't really realize the statistics. Like miscarriage rates are crazy high. Women are struggling to carry children to term at record rates. It's one of these things that people don't really talk about publicly, but the reason I bring it up is because I run yoga courses and I have studios and things, and people are constantly coming into classes that are not appropriate. We hang upside down, we do all kinds of stuff, and I'm turning people away, and people get really upset at me, and they tell me that I'm anti-feminist, that I'm telling them what to do with their body, and I really don't appreciate that because I go on Instagram and I see these women in CrossFit photos and they're doing box jumps and deadlifts with an 8-month belly, and they're getting all these thumbs up and you're a strong woman. I just like, your grandmother wouldn't have done that, and your grandmother wasn't dumb. She wasn't ignorant. She was looking for, they all, when the baby came out and it was a big fat baby, they all said, oh, it's a great baby, it's a big fat, they understood this concept. 200 years ago that you want a big fat baby, and the reason is I'm guessing it's because they understand that a premature baby is at risk, and
that's right.
So it's this weird time where women are celebrated for these really dangerous stuff. Like every day there's someone on my Instagram feed doing a handstand 8 months pregnant, or jumping down of a CrossFit box with a belly with a dumbbell on her, a barbell on her back. It's just it's not. I don't know. Call me crazy, but I think there's two lives there. I don't know if she gets to make the choice for both of those people.
Yep. I think it's been just to your earlier point, you're absolutely right that it is much better to have a nice fat baby, and even when you're talking about babies born at term, birth weight does matter. It matters a lot, and it is. Generally speaking, bigger babies are healthier babies. And being low birth weight is not a good thing. It puts you at risk for lots and lots of different complications. But I think that it's a very complicated time to think about health in pregnancy, because you're right. I think there has been, because there was this very sort of patriarchal top-down approach to pregnancy. There has been what you could see as an overcorrection in the other direction. That's the kind of thing that you are describing, where it's like, well, no one can tell me what to do with my body. And that's true. No one can tell you what to do with your body. But yes, there are certain things in pregnancy that are more risky, just medically speaking, than when you're not pregnant. And so, I think it's a hard space to navigate, certainly. It's hard for providers, it's hard for women, and I can imagine that it's really hard with, running a yoga studio where, you do have to be cognizant of the risks, and you don't want someone to put themselves at risk under your watch. And people have to be conservative about that because what you're weighing, as you said, is another life.
I don't think people have really dug into the research. It's not good. It's like the thing I always say is there's a recurring theme in sci-fi films where, no one can get pregnant. The whole world's infertile. This has been a recurring theme for 50 years in sci-fi books and sci-fi movies. It's kind of happening now. Yeah. I'm kind of coming out of this phase. I'm in my 40s now, but in my 30s, every couple I knew is having fertility problems. It's the norm. it's really happening, like the sci-fi reality where the world is having trouble conceiving and carrying children to term. It's really true. And so, when people push back at me, they say like, I'm pregnant, I'm not fragile. And I'm like, are you sure? Because it seems like this whole situation is pretty fragile. And I'm just looking at the numbers and looking at the stats, and I think it might be fragile. And I don't know the explanation, but I'm not sure.
I think a woman who's having a normal, healthy pregnancy, I don't know that I would describe her as fragile. I think, that's a healthy state of being. And most normal activities are completely healthy for someone who is experiencing a typical healthy pregnancy to do. But, yes, like rates of all of these complications are going up for reasons that are complex and big and really need to be looked at. I mean, there are things like, exposure to pollution can increase your risk of premature birth. And then who is exposed to the most pollution? Which neighborhoods are exposed to the most pollution? So always there are marginalized and vulnerable communities that are just always are more affected by these complications and these inequalities that are baked into our system. So yes, I mean it's a really big problem. And yes, things like being on your feet all day, doing heavy lifting, heavy sort of physical labor, those things can be correlated with preterm birth. But in the United States, at least, we don't have a federal law that mandates that employers give pregnant women lighter physical work, even if they have a note from their doctor. So, if we care about women and children and we want to see healthier women and children and families, these are things that we could fix on a policy level.
What is your personal history? I mean, in terms of your background, it seems like you've written a lot about food and things like this. How did you end up writing about, I'm guessing it's a personal story, no?
Yeah, I do have a personal story. So you're right. I'm a journalist. I have a degree in journalism, but for the first sort of 15 years of my career, I was mainly writing about food, health, sort of food politics, and then I had my daughter in 2014, and she was almost 3 months early, so she was born at 28 weeks. She weighed 1 pound 13 ounces, and she spent her first 2 months in intensive care, and so that was a moment for me that was a time period that really changed my life. I didn't know much about premature birth before she was born, despite the fact that I was actually premature myself. And because both of my parents died relatively young, I didn't know much about the circumstances of my birth. So I didn't know that premature birth is such a big problem. I didn't know, what it's like to sit by an incubator, to have your child on a ventilator, to have them be tube fed. Those are things that are, it's a very hidden world, the neonatal intensive care unit. We call them NICUs. It's very hidden. It's something that people often struggle to find the words for, what happened to them and their babies. But it happens to so many of us. And so I went through this, and about a year and a half later, I really struggled with postpartum anxiety. And about a year and a half after she was born, I kind of looked around and I thought, like, what happened? What was that? We were very lucky that she has done well. But I didn't understand, what it all meant. And there was so much context that I felt like I was missing. And so that's where this book came from.
And I'm just curious, my second boy, he was born late actually, but he was born with some complications, which we don't need to get into here, but I spent years, second guessing. Did I do something wrong? Did we forget the folate? I'm curious if you went through that same sort of weird mental spin out cycle. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I think almost every mother of every premature baby that I've spoken to has done a lot of wondering about, was it something that I did? Because it feels like a very fundamental failure of your body. Because when they're born, when they're born very early, they are not ready to be here in this world. So they can't breathe air. They can't, they can't suck, swallow, and breathe all at the same time. They can't maintain their own body temperature. Their bodies are really meant to be in a uterus. That's their bodies are normal for where they're supposed to be. And then we have all this battery of life supports to sort of help them survive here until their bodies can mature enough to survive on their own, is the hope. And so, yes, that sort of failure to protect her, even though I knew and I was told, that this is not your fault, I think many parents feel that way. Very, very many. Wondering, was it that I ate this thing? Was it that I went for a run? Was it, all of those questions. But, I think that's something that's really important to work through, and also for people to remember that that they're not alone, and that this is something that happens to so many people, and it's often there's no medical explanation, and that's a hard thing to live with. That lack of explanation is hard. Yeah, because you want a reason.
Yeah, I mean, as a guy, obviously I have a light experience with this, but I find people have a hard time holding space for difficult conversations, full stop. But when it comes to children, like nobody wants to hear your birth trauma story. Nobody wants to hear, like, it's like like this idea of like feeling alone. It's like you'll hear the crickets chirp when you start sharing this kind of stuff. People just do not have space they just don't want to think about it. Nobody wants to hear about the miscarriage. They don't want to hear about the birth trauma. And wow, it's really prevalent. And I think they're important conversations to have, because not only people like you who have something that they need support with, but also people who are considering conceiving, or people who are pregnant now, they need to really think through things so they can get a support system in place and they can think through what's really going to happen.
Yep. I think having a realistic idea of what pregnancy and birth can be like is only helpful for everybody. Keeping these difficult experiences quiet. And for a long time, I felt like I didn't want to go to my neighborhood moms group when Mira, my daughter, when she finally came home, I didn't want to go to these moms groups because I thought, like, what am I going to say? They're going to say, are you breastfeeding or bottle feeding? And I'm going to say, well, I was tube feeding, like there was just no, I felt like I was going to be somehow the bearer of dark information.
Yeah.
But the reality is that so many people go through these things, or some variation of these things. And I think that when we speak about them out loud to each other, we gain power, and we can help each other with these things. But yeah, absolutely. I think it's important. I think it's really important that we have a more balanced idea of what pregnancy and childbirth and child rearing can be like. I mean, one thing I will say I do remember is that when I was pregnant, my OB, because I was 34 at the time, we had to talk all about how I had this like slightly higher risk of giving birth to a child with Down syndrome. And so we, going through, we got they can give you a blood test now to check the fetal chromosomes. So we talked about that, quite a bit. We never really spoke about my risk of preterm birth. And my risk of preterm birth was something like 40 times higher than my risk of giving birth to a baby with Down syndrome, because preterm birth is very, very, very common, but it's just not really spoken about in any context.
Yeah, there's all kinds of other things too. I remember when I went in, I started reading the stats. This was recently, and it was, 1% of births have some sort of complication. I was like, I'm doing the math here, and I was like, that means yesterday there was a complication, And
right.
I started reading other stats. It's like, the worst time to have a child is on a weekday in the middle, or weekend on the middle of the night. My second child was born on a Saturday night at like 2 a.m. Doctor came in, pretty sure he'd had a couple of drinks, and I'm sitting there, and you're just really helpless. But all I could do is, look him in the eyes and say, please take care of my kid. But I mean, I feel like I was better off knowing that information than being ignorant. And I I wish there were more people willing to have these conversations because, again, even that conversation, nobody wants to think about the fact that their doctor's probably coming in after a dinner party at 3 a.m, but that's kind of the harsh reality. And so you wrote this book. Tell us a little bit about the history. How has this changed, like 100 years prior? A lot less, a lot more?
Yeah.
What did it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you about one thing that just brought that, what you just said brought up for me was just the idea that a lot of my research for the book just made me think like doctors are people too. You know, the healthcare system doesn't exist outside of humanity. The healthcare system is of us. And so all of the good that means, but also all of the bad. And it's just complicated, you know. There's no sort of, you know, there's no perfect system. But yes, so the history of neonatology, which is sort of the history of treating premature babies, is incredibly fascinating, very rich topic. Things have gotten so much better in the past, I would say, 100 years. We have gone from having no treatment for premature babies whatsoever to having this really sophisticated multi-organ system life support that's available at NICUs now. So the incubator was actually invented in 1880. But interestingly, you know, parents and midwives had always had these sort of techniques for trying to get a very small baby to live. So parents and midwives all over the world, in all eras of history, found ways to keep tiny babies warm. And actually, in my own family, my grandfather and his twin were born very early, and my great-grandmother, they were born at home. My great-grandmother was an immigrant from Italy, and she actually incubated my grandfather and his twin in her oven. It was set to a very, very low temperature. This is something that people did. You know, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like people always found ways to try to help very small babies. But in terms of a medical context and having sort of organized treatment, that really started around the turn of the 20th century. And interestingly, incubators it was immediately obvious that incubators worked, and they're a relatively simple machine. The earliest ones had hot water tanks underneath the bed, so it was just like a little box with a bed on top and hot water tanks on the bottom. And there was, I think, the first study on the first incubator showed that it improved survival by 50%, or I'm sorry, it doubled survival. So babies born under 4 pounds went from surviving 30% of the time to surviving 60% of the time. But there was an interesting sort of dynamic, which was that some people weren't sure that those babies should be treated, that they should survive, that they were really meant to be here. So at that time, they were sometimes called weaklings. And also it became obvious that the incubators needed basically full-time 24-hour nursing staff, and that was expensive. And so the story of incubation has really been about this sort of dance between ambivalence about treating babies and optimism. And luckily, the optimism really has won out, but it's sort of a very long and winding road. In fact, the first incubator award in the United States was actually a sideshow on Coney Island, where people paid 25 cents to come in and see the tiny babies in the incubators.
Wow.
And that was how the guy who ran this clinic, that was how he funded the care, because he couldn't get anyone in the medical establishment to invest in this. Yeah, it's a really rich and fascinating story.
And so with the book specifically, what are you hoping to share with the world? What inspired you to share the story?
You know, I think that I started with my own questions in the wake of what has happened to us. And I thought, if I have these questions, you know, maybe other parents have these questions too. And so I think my goal was twofold. One was to understand how have we arrived at this moment in time in which a baby like my daughter, who weighs less than 2 pounds, who needs life support for every vital function, how have we arrived at a moment where a baby like her is very likely to survive and do well. I found that incredible. I wanted to know the answer to that. And so that was one of my goals. And then my other goal really was to understand what it means now. What are the current controversies? What are the dilemmas that exist in modern NICUs? And also, why have we had so much success treating premature babies, but so little success preventing premature birth? And what does that say about us as a society? What does it say about us from a public health perspective? So those were some of the questions I wanted to answer, because I found that premature birth intersects with all these really big topics that really concern all of us. But also I wanted other parents to feel less alone, because one thing that people have told me over and over again is, that they find resonance in my story, that they experienced many of the same things, and yet they felt really alone. So here we all are going through this very traumatic experience, and feeling very alone when in fact we are not alone. And so I really wanted people to feel that and to know that.
Sarah, I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your work. For people who'd like to follow you online and connect with you, is there a place that we should send them?
Yes, they can go to sarahdigregorio.com, or follow me on Twitter at Sarah Digregorio.
When I first started practicing yoga back in 2002, I was so stiff. I couldn't touch my toes. My fingers would come about halfway down my shins. When I sat on the floor, my knees were way up off the ground. My hips were so tight, and back bends were totally impossible. When I extended my arms above my head, that was already a really deep back bend for me. So I was really frustrated, and all my yoga teachers told me that yoga was not about flexibility, that I was focusing on the wrong things. And I got really frustrated because that was easy for them to say. They were already flexible. I was really struggling, and everything I did in yoga was about flexibility, because every single thing, whether it was sitting on the floor or any kind of basic forward bend, standing pose, anything really, I couldn't even begin to practice because I was so locked up. And so I started doing a lot of research. I started talking to a lot of people outside of the yoga community, specifically gymnasts and dancers, and people who are a little more comfortable talking about mobility training. And very quickly, I started to learn that in order to make flexibility gains, you really need to supplement your yoga practice. And even the yoga teachers I talked to who were very flexible, who developed it later in life, when I actually saw behind the curtains what was going on, all of them were doing supplemental stretching in the evening. And there were some things that all of these people, whether it was the gymnasts or the dancers or the yoga teachers who had discovered flexibility later in life, the things that I found consistently were they were doing practice outside of their practice, meaning supplemental stretching. All of them were using long hold passive stretches. And then very quickly I learned how to add a couple of other interesting things onto that practice, including breathing and time under passive tension. And essentially I came up with a protocol that really helps you to open up your body. I call it gravity yoga. I've been teaching it now for 12 years, something like that. And it's really, really effective for hamstrings, for locked up hips, for a stiff back, shoulders. And we've been teaching it to students all over the world. We teach it in my studios here in Barcelona. It's a very, very popular class. And for the first time ever, I'm having a gravity yoga teacher training. And it's an online program that teaches you how to work with clients in a 60-minute guided class, or how to work with athletes or CrossFitters or yoga students who are stuck in short bursts to supplement whatever else they're doing. So you can work privately or in yoga studios, fitness centers. I'm really excited about this program. It's heavy on anatomy and biomechanics. We dive deep into sequencing. We walk you through pose by pose exactly how to teach this, and we also give you all the why behind the how. It's really a great program. To learn more, go to gravityyogatraining.com. Course starts soon. I'm super excited. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener Anissa asks, Lucas, what do you think of Ayurveda in the context of nutritional recommendations and in terms of finding your dosha? So Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine, and just like there is traditional Chinese medicine and traditional folk medicine, traditional Native American medicine, every culture has traditional medicine. Traditional Indian medicine, Ayurveda, is very, very old. It's a very rich tradition, and it's pretty interesting. There's lots of interesting things in it. A lot of the nutrition stuff is really outdated in the same way that a lot of the medicines from hundreds of years ago are kind of outdated. Weird cures like, mercury or silver. Things that were the best ideas that they had at the time aren't really the best now. When Anissa is talking about your dosha, in Ayurveda, there's this concept of prakriti, which is your kind of your personal nature. You could think about it. If you've ever taken like a personality test in Ayurveda, they have these what's your dosha tests to figure out what your prakriti is, what your dosha is. And the reality is we're all a mix of different things, but you have kapha and pitta and vata, and they're correlated with different foods and different energies and different body types. So someone who's a kapha body type tends to gain weight easily, has bigger bones and broad shoulders, and is very sturdy and calm. And somebody who's a pitta body type has kind of a medium build, tends to have a really strong digestion and be pretty balanced. Somebody who's vata tends to be very lean and light, small boned, high energy, difficult with grounding, and all of these are overgeneralizations. You can't actually put people into 3 categories. But like all of these things, personality tests, get to know your body, get to know your digestion, get to know your constitution, I think it's really valuable. I think where people run into trouble is when they take it kind of like they would take a horoscope, or when they would take a personality test and decide, I am an INTJ, so this means I will always work this way and act this way, and it's not that simple, right? But I would definitely recommend, if you've never done it before, if you go online and you search what's my dosha quiz, not dosa is a food, but what's my dosha quiz, you'll find a bunch of quizzes and you can learn about your body type. The nutritional recommendations that correlate to Ayurveda, I'm not a huge fan of, and again, most of them are just outdated based on limited nutritional availability and limited resources. Keep in mind that just 100 years ago, starvation was a huge problem in India, and so a lot of the dietary recommendations were based on food scarcity and what was available. Previous to 100 years ago, just rampant starvation and things like this. And so understanding your body, huge fan of. Traditional Ayurvedic recommendations, not a huge fan of. And these ideas that, certain people shouldn't drink cold water, and it gets a little bit crazy. So with all things, I think it's just important to contextualize it and use it as appropriate. But I think the more you can understand how your unique body works, your sleep rhythms, your nutritional needs, your metabolic tendencies, I think it's really, really helpful. So I'm a fan of the approach. I'm just not a fan of the dogma. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener Summer says, I've been listening to your podcast and know you're an advocate of using vitamins. There are so many to choose from. I wonder if you recommend a certain brand for best absorption. I'm looking to get a multivitamin rather than buying them separately. What would you recommend? Any brands? I get this question a lot, and yeah, I totally recommend using vitamins. In fact, everybody recommends using vitamins, including the government and the World Health Organization. There's always this thing where somebody writes to me and says, I don't believe in vitamins. I get all my nutrients through food. It's like, do you? How do you know? Have you gotten your blood work done? Because almost every person who I've seen with blood work has a deficiency in something. In fact, there's vitamin D added to milk, there's iodine added to salt. Vitamin A is reversing blinding in people who are nutritionally deprived. I mean, this is not, iron deficiency is pandemic. Something like 2 billion people are deficient in iron. It's not about a belief system here. It's not like an ideology or anything like that. It would be great, an ideal world, if you could get all of your nutrients from food. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen, and it's never happens. Fossil records of ancient humans also show radical deficiencies. Nature is not balanced. Nature is mean, and it's cruel, and there's droughts and famines, there's feasts and starvation. It's part of the cycle of life, is we're desperately trying to find balance, and we never find it. In your pursuit of balance, you should pop on by your local pharmacy and pick up some vitamins, and they will do you good. You should get some blood tests done too. In terms of what you should take, I'm not a big fan of multivitamins because they tend to mix things that shouldn't be mixed, and the timing is really difficult. So for example, something like vitamin C or methylsulfonylmethane, some of those things can kind of disrupt your sleep, whereas something like magnesium can actually make you sleepy. Something like B vitamins can cause gas and bloating, and other things can kind of ease your stomach. The bigger reason, though, that I don't like multivitamins is because you have to take so many. So a good multivitamin, you'll have to take 6 or even 8 500 to 800 milligram capsules. So you're taking horse pills all throughout the day. It's really a lot. And again, the biggest Backlash is gas and bloating. Basically, when you take all that crazy stuff together, it's very difficult to have it be easy on the gut. These one-a-day Centrums and things like that, they don't really have any kind of effective dose. They'll keep you from getting scurvy, but not much else. So here are my top recommendations. First of all, everybody's different. At different times of your life, you might need iron, you might need B12, you might need all these things. If you're a plant-based person, first of all, take B12 and take it every day. You absolutely need to. You won't get it from your plants, you won't get it from your spirulina. It's not going to work out. I've looked at all the research on this. Really, you have to take B12. So if you're a plant-based person, which I know a bunch of you listening are, you need to take B12. Take it every day. Be responsible. Take care of it. Your brain health is at risk here. For everyone else listening, probably everyone should take vitamin D. I give my kids vitamin D every time they're around me in the kitchen. I shove a spoonful of vitamin D in their mouth, and spoonful is an exaggeration. It's about 4 drops actually. But how much vitamin D should you take? That I don't know. But go get your blood work done. You'll find that you're deficient, and then you probably want to supplement with somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 international units per day until you get your levels back to a normal place, or normal to high level, and then from there you might back down to 2,000 to 5,000 international units per day. It's not nutritional advice though. Go check with your blood tests. It's certainly possible to overdo it with vitamin D, but I don't know anyone who has. In fact, most people I know are chronically deficient and they're trying to get their levels back up. The second thing you should consider, and vitamin D, the brand is totally irrelevant summer, so get whatever you can find. If you can, get vitamin D with K2, vitamin K2, both of which are fat-soluble vitamins, so it's good if you eat them with food. The next thing that probably everybody should take, either in whole food or supplement form, or even better, both, is omega-3s. Omega-3 fats used to be present in all kinds of foods, both plant and animal, and they're deficient now in both. Omega-3s would come in the form of flax seeds and chia seeds, those are ALA, and then in the form of krill oil, algae oil, and fish oil, that's DHA and EPA. And I would recommend that you incorporate those every day into your life. It's really good for your brain, more than anything, your brain health, and they're anti-inflammatory as well. The last thing you should probably consider is a B complex. This is the one I'll give you the most warning on because B complex vitamins can really upset your stomach. Most B vitamins are made through a fermentation process, and depending on who made your B vitamins, they can really mess with your gut, and depending on how they're mixed. So I often will take B vitamins separately, at least B12 I'll take separately, and I would encourage you to experiment because those can really send you running to the bathroom with disaster pants. And who cares if you're nutritionally satiated if you're sitting on the toilet all day, right? It does no good. So to reiterate, vitamin D3 you should probably be taking. You should almost certainly be taking omega-3 in the form of whole food and perhaps a supplemental form as well, fish oil, krill oil, algae oil, chia seeds, flax seeds, and then a B complex. And this is the kind of stuff that pregnant women are given, and I have no idea why we treat pregnant women better than we treat normal women or normal men. Why don't we take care of each other? I'm not sure, but the moment a woman falls pregnant, the OBGYN immediately gives vitamins. You must take this B vitamins. You must take these vitamin D. This is dangerous. It was also dangerous before. I'm not sure why we don't take care of ourselves, but I will encourage you and I will give you a permission to take care of yourself. Now, other things that might be helpful at different times. We have lots of listeners who get great benefit from supplementing with magnesium at night. We have lots of listeners who might be low in iron. We have lots of listeners who are taking selenium or zinc or all kinds of other things. But throwing everything at the kitchen sink is very likely to stress your body, very likely to stress your gut, and very difficult to sustain. So I always encourage people to start off with something simple, get your blood tested, look at your diet, see what makes sense, and you can adjust accordingly based on what you're eating. It's very easy to overdo it. Dave Asprey recently posted a photo online of him with 300 pills in his hands and mouth, saying that he eats that many a day. I would never do that. I would rather die prematurely than have the gastrointestinal distress that comes from eating 300 capsules of vitamins per day. And so you really do have to find a balance, and you can overdo it. In terms of brands, Summer, the omega-3 you want to err on the side of expensive brands. The cheap stuff you'll find in CVS are no good. But for things like vitamin C, for things like vitamin D, for magnesium citrate, these kinds of things, the brands are not very relevant. You'll find very little difference between these. These are highly controlled laboratories manufacturing very pure substances that are almost identical brand to brand. So I wouldn't worry too much about those. But for your omega-3 fats, I would be extra cautious and buy a high-end brand. I don't like to name brands because these companies change and their suppliers change. I will say that I like to buy from iherb.com. I know a lot of people buy from Amazon. because you have Amazon Prime, but iherb.com has a much better selection, really great prices, and it's just an amazing company to order from in terms of nutritional supplements. They have everything. Hope that's helpful, Summer.
This week's iTunes review is by Shui. Shui says, I started listening to Lucas when I was training to be a yoga teacher. As a scientist, I love the fact that Lucas is hungry for information, and this hunger has led to a great deal of knowledge. He always gives a balanced opinion based on his experience and knowledge. It is the most informative and interesting podcast that I return to weekly, covering a huge range of fascinating subjects. Congratulations, Shui. You have won a Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we will ship it to you.
If you're a regular Yoga Talk Show listener, you'll definitely want to get on my email list. Go to yogabody.com/sign me up. When you enter your email address there, we always have free giveaways every month, yoga straps, water bottles, discounts in our shop, and all kinds of other things. When you sign up at yogabody.com/sign me up, I'll send you just one email a week with updates about the show, special offers, new courses, and valuable information that I think you'll find useful. So go to yogabody.com/sign me up to claim your free prize now.